When a billionaire tries to demolish an old bakery for a new skyscraper, a little boy offers his piggy bank to save it, unaware that it would change both their lives forever. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching us from, and please like this video to support the channel. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. Graham Westwood had no patience for nostalgia. To him, the past was nothing more than a collection of outdated ideas, and sentimentality was a roadblock to progress. He built his empire on efficiency, profit, and forward motion, leaving no room for sentiment or unnecessary attachments. That was why, as he sat in his sleek, glass-walled office overlooking the city skyline, he barely glanced at the report in front of him before signing off on it. Another project approved. Another building about to rise. And another piece of old, crumbling history about to be erased. Maggie's Bakery was next on the list. It was a tiny shop on the corner of a quiet street, one he barely remembered existing until his development team flagged it as an obstacle to his latest high-rise project. The numbers were simple. A luxury skyscraper in that location would bring in millions, while the bakery barely scraped by, selling pastries to the same loyal customers who had been going there for decades. There was no competition. He had already bought out most of the surrounding properties, and the few holdouts were folding fast. The bakery was the last piece. His assistant, Eleanor, tapped her pen against her clipboard, watching him sign the final approval. "You know, the neighborhood won't take this one lightly," she said, her tone carefully neutral. Graham barely looked up. "They never do. It won't matter." She hesitated. "This bakery isn't just another business. It's been there for nearly 100 years. That's exactly why it needs to go." He glanced at her, expression unreadable. 100 years of stagnation. It's outdated. The city is evolving, and that corner is more valuable as something new. Eleanor exhaled through her nose, but said nothing more. She had worked for him long enough to know that arguments about sentimentality never swayed him. Across town, in the warm, flower-dusted air of Maggie's Bakery, a much different conversation was taking place. Maggie, Dawson wiped her hands on her apron, sighing as she looked over the papers spread out on the counter. Her bakery had survived wars, economic crashes, and generations of families coming and going, but it wouldn't survive a billionaire's ambition. "You can't fight him on this, Maggie," Theo's mother, Sarah, said gently, sipping her coffee at one of the small wooden tables near the window. "He has too much power, too many lawyers. Even if you refuse to sell, the city will approve his permits. He'll find a way." Maggie's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm not just handing it over. This place means something to people." Sarah nodded, her gaze drifting toward the front counter, where her son Theo was perched on a stool, kicking his feet as he carefully examined the powdered sugar buns displayed behind the glass. He always picked the one with the most sugar, a ritual passed down from his father. "Theo, don't touch that," she called absent-mindedly as he reached forward, pressing his fingers against the glass. "Wasn't gonna," he mumbled, but he quickly withdrew his hand. The bakery had been a second home to him for as long as he could remember. The smell of fresh bread, the sound of the bell jingling when someone entered, the way Maggie always let him lick the spoon when she made frosting, it was all part of his world. But it wasn't just about the treats. It was about his dad. Before his father passed away, Sunday mornings had always been theirs. They would walk down the street together, his dad's warm hand wrapped around his as they stepped into the bakery. No matter what, his dad always bought him a sugar-dusted bun. "Best way to start the day," he'd say, ruffling Theo's curls before taking a bite of his own pastry. But now, Sundays felt empty. The bakery was the last piece of that memory he could still hold on to. So when Theo overheard his mother and Maggie talking, when he heard the words, "It's inevitable," and "He'll find a way," something inside him twisted. He didn't understand legal battles or city permits, but he understood one thing: Maggie's Bakery couldn't disappear. Not when it was the only place that still smelled like Sundays with his dad. He slid off the stool and ran to the counter, looking up at Maggie with wide, determined eyes. "How much do you need?" Maggie blinked. "What? How much do you need to save the bakery?" Sarah laughed softly. "Sweetheart, it's not that simple." But Theo was already running toward the door, heart pounding. "I'll be right back." By the time he made it home, his mother's warnings about running off without telling her were already forgotten. He burst into his room, darting straight to the shelf where his piggy bank sat, a ceramic spaceship, blue with tiny silver stars. It was heavy when he lifted it, full of allowance money, birthday gifts from relatives, and whatever coins he had picked up off the sidewalk. He had been saving for something special. This was it. That night, he sat on his bed, counting every coin, stacking them in careful piles. He didn't know how much it would take to save the bakery, but he was sure it had to be a lot. It didn't matter. He'd give everything. The next morning, he didn't tell his mother where he was going. He only knew one thing. If a billionaire was going to take away his bakery, then he had to talk to the billionaire himself. Clutching the heavy piggy bank in both arms, Theo marched into the tallest building in the city, his small frame barely visible among the crowd of professionals rushing to work. The marble floors gleamed under the bright lights, and the air smelled like something cold and unfamiliar. He felt tiny in the massive lobby, but he didn't waver. A security guard spotted him almost immediately. "Hey, kid! I need to see Mr. Westwood," Theo declared, setting his piggy bank on the counter in front of him. "It's important." The guard exchanged a look with the receptionist, who arched an eyebrow. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Theo admitted. "But I have money." He patted the side of the piggy bank for emphasis. "Mr. Westwood doesn't take walk-ins," the receptionist said, unimpressed. "Especially from..." She eyed his sticky hands and scuffed sneakers. "Children." Theo frowned. "That's dumb. I'm a customer." The security guard sighed. "Look, kid, what's going on?" The voice cut through the lobby's noise like a blade. Theo turned just as a tall man in a sharp suit strode toward them. He didn't need an introduction. Theo knew who he was. Graham Westwood. The man who wanted to steal his bakery. The guard straightened. "He says he has money, sir." Graham's gaze flicked down to the piggy bank, then back to Theo. He almost looked amused. "Does he now?" Theo lifted his chin, determination burning in his chest. "I want to buy the bakery." For the first time in a long while, Graham Westwood was speechless. Graham Westwood wasn't easily caught off guard, but as he stood in the middle of the sleek, high-ceilinged lobby of his corporate empire, staring down at a scrawny 7-year-old with an iron grip on a ceramic piggy bank, he found himself momentarily at a loss for words. The boy's expression was dead serious, his big eyes fixed on Graham like he was facing down a villain in a storybook. Around them, executives, assistants, and security guards paused in their routines, stealing glances at the absurdity of the scene. Graham recovered quickly, smoothing his tie as he studied the kid. "You want to buy the bakery?" he repeated, as if clarifying would somehow make it less ridiculous. Theo nodded, determination written all over his face. "Yes. And I have money." He patted the piggy bank for emphasis. The receptionist stifled a laugh. A security guard shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure whether to step in or let the scene play out. Graham could already hear Eleanor's sigh from wherever she was in the building. He crossed his arms, regarding the boy with mild amusement. "That's so?" he mused, glancing at the piggy bank. "And just how much are we talking?" Theo exhaled as if this should have been obvious. "All of it." Graham arched a brow. "Which is?" Theo's small hands gripped the piggy bank tighter. "A lot." A low chuckle escaped Graham's throat, and he gestured toward the elevators. "All right then, if it's a lot, let's see it." Theo hesitated for only a second before hugging the piggy bank close and marching toward the elevator, his sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. The receptionist exchanged a wide-eyed look with the security guard, but neither said a word as Graham followed the boy inside. Up on the top floor, the difference between their worlds became even clearer. Graham's office was all steel, glass, and clean lines. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased a sprawling city skyline, and sleek black furniture sat perfectly arranged, untouched and impersonal. Everything in the space spoke of power and control, of a man who had built his life to be untouchable. Theo, on the other hand, belonged to a completely different universe. He plopped his piggy bank down on Graham's glossy black desk with a loud clunk, leaving a faint smudge of powdered sugar from his fingers on the pristine surface. Graham eyed the smudge, then the piggy bank. "Go on, then. Let's see your offer." Theo hesitated, glancing at the ceramic spaceship as if he had just realized how permanent this moment was. But then, his face steeled with resolve, and he flipped the piggy bank over, shaking it violently. A handful of coins, a couple of wrinkled dollar bills, and oddly, a red button tumbled onto the desk. One of the pennies rolled off the edge and disappeared under a chair. Silence stretched between them. Graham slowly leaned forward, staring at the small pile of money. "That's it?" Theo's chest puffed out. "It's all of it." Graham pressed his lips together, trying to suppress the smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You're a little short." Theo didn't flinch. "Then you need to listen harder." Graham blinked. The words, so confident and unshaken, caught him off guard. He glanced at the boy's face, expecting to see the usual childish frustration or the quivering lip of an impending tantrum. Instead, Theo was perfectly still, his chin lifted, his small fingers curled into fists at his sides. The silence was broken by the sound of hurried footsteps. "Theo!" The door burst open, and Maggie and Sarah rushed inside, breathless and horrified. Sarah's face was flushed with panic. "Oh my God, how did you even get here? I was worried sick." Maggie's sharp gaze darted from Theo to Graham to the scattered pile of coins on the desk. She exhaled through her nose. "Oh, for heaven's sake." Theo, unfazed, stood his ground. "I'm negotiating." Sarah pressed her fingers against her temples. "You snuck into a corporate building to negotiate with a billionaire?" Theo shrugged. "He let me up." Maggie sighed, putting her hands on her hips. "And what exactly were you planning to do once he said no?" Theo's jaw clenched. "He hasn't said no yet." Sarah shot Graham an apologetic look, but before she could start explaining, Graham held up a hand, stopping her. "Let him finish," he said, voice even. Sarah's mouth fell open slightly, clearly stunned. Maggie narrowed her eyes at him, studying him as if trying to figure out what game he was playing. Theo, taking the cue, turned back to Graham, lifting his chin. "This bakery matters. It's the only place in the whole world that still smells like my dad." For the second time in 10 minutes, Graham found himself at a loss for words. Theo continued, voice steady but firm. "You probably don't care. You have lots of money and buildings and people who do what you say. But the bakery isn't just a building. It's Sundays. It's sugar buns. It's my dad's hand on my shoulder when he used to take me there." He hesitated, his little fingers curling slightly. "And if you tear it down, it'll be like he was never there." A lump settled in Sarah's throat. Maggie, usually sharp-tongued and quick to snap, suddenly looked down, pretending to adjust her apron. Graham, however, simply leaned back in his chair, studying the boy in front of him. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the city outside the windows. Then, to everyone's surprise, a slow smirk curved Graham's lips. "You're a stubborn little negotiator." Theo nodded, unflinching. "Maggie says being stubborn is just believing harder than everyone else." Graham tapped his fingers against the desk, then finally exhaled. "All right, kid. I'll make you a deal." Sarah blinked. "Wait, what?" Maggie's arms crossed as she eyed him warily. "I don't trust that tone." Graham ignored them both, looking directly at Theo. "You want to save the bakery? Fine. Show me it's worth saving." Theo frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Graham continued, "if you want me to reconsider, you have to prove that bakery isn't just a sentimental relic. Show me it's a real business. Make a profit. Make it something that actually works instead of something people just wish would work." Theo's eyes widened. "You mean?" Like a challenge? Graham nodded. 1 month. If you can turn that place into a functioning, profitable business in 30 days, I'll reconsider the demolition. He leaned forward slightly. Think you can do that? Maggie's brows shot up. Now hold on. But Theo was already grinning. He stuck out his tiny hand, as if he was sealing the biggest deal of his life. You got yourself a deal. Graham shook the boy's hand, smirking. Sarah groaned, rubbing her temples. I can't believe this is happening. Maggie folded her arms and exhaled. Neither can I. But as she looked at Theo, who was practically vibrating with excitement, and then at Graham, whose smirk didn't quite reach his eyes, she realized something. This had just become interesting. Maggie sighed as she locked the bakery door that evening, her fingers lingering on the worn brass handle. The whole day had been a blur, and the absurdity of what had just happened still hadn't fully settled in. She glanced down at Theo, who was practically bouncing on the sidewalk, his face lit up with excitement. He had no idea what he had just gotten himself into. She was still trying to figure out why Westwood had entertained the idea in the first place. A billionaire like him didn't make bets for fun. Sarah, standing a few feet away, had her arms crossed, looking just as bewildered. I cannot believe you agreed to this, she muttered under her breath, shaking her head. Maggie exhaled. I didn't exactly have a choice, did I? She looked down at Theo, who was now grinning up at her. And you, young man, have no idea what running a business actually means. Theo, still riding the high of his so-called victory, shrugged. How hard can it be? People love your bakery, Maggie. We just have to remind them. Maggie narrowed her eyes at him, then at the night sky as if searching for patience somewhere in the stars. Do you have any idea how much money we actually need to make to prove we're profitable? A lot more than what's in that piggy bank of yours. Theo wasn't deterred. He turned to his mother, eyes bright. Mom, you always say if you want something, you have to work for it, right? Sarah pinched the bridge of her nose. That's supposed to apply to things like homework, Theo. Not saving an entire business. But Maggie was already rubbing her temples. All right, fine. You want to play businessman? We'll play businessman. But you listen to everything I say. No ridiculous ideas. No running off to make any more deals without talking to me first. And when you realize how hard this actually is, you don't get to sulk about it. Theo nodded so fast his curls bounced. Deal. Maggie muttered something under her breath about needing stronger coffee, but she had already accepted it. She wasn't really doing this for the bakery, she had made her peace with losing it. But the look in Theo's eyes, the stubborn little fire burning there, reminded her of someone. She couldn't place who. Maybe a bit of herself when she was younger. Maybe someone else entirely. Either way, she wasn't about to be the one to snuff it out. Meanwhile, miles away in his glass tower, Graham Westwood sat in his office, staring at the city lights, wondering what in the world had possessed him to agree to such an absurd challenge. He should have just dismissed the kid and let the whole thing die out naturally. Instead, he had given him a chance, one that, logically speaking, the bakery had no real shot at winning. A month wasn't long enough to turn around a failing business, and he knew it. He knew business, he knew numbers, and he knew what it took to survive in an industry that ate people alive. The bakery wouldn't make it. And yet, when Theo had looked at him with that ridiculous confidence, when he had extended his tiny, sticky hand and shaken on the deal, Graham had felt something shift. It had been a long time since anyone had looked him in the eye like that, like he was just a person, not some untouchable billionaire. He should have laughed the kid off. Instead, he had shaken his hand and made a bet he couldn't quite explain. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his thumb against his temple. Eleanor had been in his office 5 minutes after Theo and his entourage had left, looking at him like he had just announced he was quitting business to become a monk. You're betting against a child, sir, she had said flatly. He had smirked. No, I'm letting him learn a valuable lesson about business. She had crossed her arms. And what if he actually pulls it off? He had scoffed at that. Then I'll admit I was wrong. But that's not going to happen. Eleanor had given him a long, unreadable look before shaking her head. "You keep surprising me, Westwood." Now, sitting alone in his office, Graham let out a breath and rolled his shoulders. This was nothing more than a passing amusement, a slight detour before his original plan went into motion. The kid would struggle, the bakery would close, and the world would move on. It was inevitable. Except the next morning, he opened his inbox to find an email titled, "Our Business Plan," in bright capital letters, sent from a barely functioning email address that looked suspiciously like a child had set it up. Graham clicked it open. The email contained a scanned drawing, crayon, no less, of what appeared to be a new bakery plan, complete with stick figures and a series of arrows pointing toward what looked like a very aggressive advertising strategy involving free cookies and a promise of a buy one get 3 free special. Graham let out a laugh before he could stop himself. The kid had no idea what he was doing. And yet, against all logic, Graham found himself looking forward to watching him try. Back at the bakery, Theo was already in full planning mode. He had Maggie sitting at one of the small round tables, a notepad in front of him, scribbling with fierce determination. "First," he said, tapping his pencil against the page, "we need more customers." Maggie sighed. "Yes, thank you for that groundbreaking business revelation, boss." Theo ignored the sarcasm. "We need to tell more people about the bakery. Flyers. Social media. And we need to make people want to come in." Maggie narrowed her eyes. "We already have regulars, Theo. The problem isn't wanting to come in. It's that they can't come in enough to keep us afloat." Theo's brows scrunched. "Then we need new people. What if we give them free samples?" Maggie considered it. "Could work, but giving away free stuff won't make us money." Theo's expression brightened. "What if we make people work for free stuff?" Sarah, who had been standing nearby, raised an eyebrow. "I'm afraid to ask what that means." Theo grinned. "Like contests. If people post about us online, they get a free pastry. Or if they bring in a friend, they get something extra. We make people want to talk about us." Maggie rubbed her chin, giving him a long look. "All right, kid," she said finally. "That's not the worst idea I've ever heard." Theo beamed. Sarah sighed. And somewhere in a skyscraper across town, Graham Westwood closed his laptop, shaking his head to himself. The bet had started. And something told him this was going to be far more interesting than he had anticipated. The next morning, Maggie's bakery was in chaos, and Theo was at the center of it, arms crossed, wearing an oversized apron that nearly swallowed him whole. The grand reopening, as he had proudly called it, was happening whether Maggie was ready or not. The chalkboard sign outside now had hastily scrawled new deals in bright colors. Buy one, get 3 free. Followed by, in Theo's messiest handwriting, free cookie if you tell us a joke. Maggie had nearly choked on her coffee when she saw it. "Theo," she said, pinching the bridge of her nose, "do you realize we are supposed to make money, not give away all our inventory?" Theo, completely undeterred, grinned. "People love free stuff. They'll come in, they'll like it, and they'll keep coming back." Sarah, standing beside him, muttered, "Or they'll just take the free stuff and never come back." Theo waved her off. "We have to get people talking. Once they remember how good the bakery is, we'll sell even more." Maggie exhaled, shaking her head, but deep down, she couldn't help but admire his enthusiasm. He was treating this like the biggest mission of his life. The kid had more confidence than half the business owners she knew. And strangely enough, his plan, flawed as it was, seemed to be working. The first trickle of customers turned into a flood by mid-morning. It started with the regulars, Mr. Lawson, who had been coming in for fresh rye bread every Tuesday since before Theo was born, and Mrs. Patel, who never left without a lemon tart. They smiled at Theo's enthusiasm, humored his "one free cookie for a joke" policy, and left looking more amused than usual. But then the crowd grew. Young parents stopped by with their kids, drawn by the idea of a fun, friendly bakery instead of some impersonal coffee chain. College students popped in, laughing at the ridiculous deals. Even a group of construction workers from down the street, clearly skeptical at first, eventually walked away with more pastries than they knew what to do with. Theo, in the middle of it all, was beaming, handing out receipts with smiley faces drawn on them, giving customers extra napkins on the house, and chatting like he had been born to run a business. Maggie had to admit, he was good at making people feel welcome. From his office, Graham Westwood watched the chaos unfold with a detached sort of amusement. He had expected this challenge to crumble under the weight of reality within a week, but somehow, the bakery was packed. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin as he glanced at Eleanor, who was reading the latest sales reports from his own businesses but had been sneaking peeks at the live footage of the bakery's storefront on her tablet. "You seem invested," he remarked dryly. Eleanor didn't even look up. "It's the most entertaining thing you've done all year, sir." Graham smirked but said nothing. He wouldn't admit it, but there was something oddly compelling about the whole thing. Maybe it was the absurdity of watching a 7-year-old run a bakery like it was a lemonade stand, or maybe it was the sheer ridiculousness of that deal Theo had scrawled on the sign. Graham knew numbers. He knew business. This bakery shouldn't be surviving. And yet, somehow, it wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. Eleanor glanced at him over her glasses. "You should go down there." Graham snorted. "Absolutely not." "Why not?" "Because I don't waste time on lost causes." Eleanor arched a brow, unimpressed. "Really? Because it kind of looks like you already did." Graham ignored her, turning back to his computer. Later that afternoon, when the bakery had a slight lull between rushes, Maggie slumped onto a stool, rubbing her temples. "I can't believe I'm saying this, but somehow we're keeping up." Theo grinned, dusting his hands off. "Told you. People love a good deal." Sarah sighed, flipping through the numbers on the calculator. "We gave away more than we sold today, though. If we keep this up, we'll run out of supplies before the week's over." Theo frowned. "Okay. New plan. We do less free stuff but make people want to come back." Maggie raised an eyebrow. "And how exactly do you propose we do that, business genius?" Theo tapped his chin, thinking. "What if we make a special pastry? Something nobody else has?" Maggie crossed her arms. "Like what?" Theo's face lit up. "Something big. Something fun. Something." Before he could finish, the bell above the bakery door jingled, and the room went completely still. Graham Westwood had just walked in. The contrast between him and the cozy warmth of the bakery was almost comical. His crisp, tailored suit and polished shoes didn't belong in a place where the scent of cinnamon and vanilla filled the air, where the floorboards creaked under the weight of history. He stood near the entrance for a moment, hands in his pockets, gaze sweeping across the space. Maggie narrowed her eyes, wiping her hands on her apron. "You here to measure the place before you tear it down?" Graham smirked. "Just observing." Theo, unbothered, grinned. "Did you come for a free cookie?" Graham looked down at him. "I don't eat sweets." Theo gasped, looking personally offended. "That's the saddest thing I've ever heard." Maggie folded her arms. "If you're here to gloat, Westwood, I don't have time for it." Graham glanced at the bustling bakery, at the full tables and the sound of people chatting between bites of pastries. His gaze drifted to the old glass display case, the shelves behind the counter, the framed black and white photos that had been there for decades. And then, for a split second, something flickered in his expression. It was faint, so faint that even he barely recognized it, but it was there. Something about the place felt familiar. He didn't know why, but the scent of warm dough and sugar clung to something at the edges of his mind, something long buried and forgotten. Theo was still watching him expectantly, waiting for an answer about the cookie. Graham exhaled, shaking off the thought. "I just came to see how the business plan was going," he said finally, smirking. "You have, 27 days left?" Theo grinned. "Yep. And you're going to be really sorry when we win." Graham chuckled, shaking his head. "We'll see about that." He turned to leave, but just before he stepped out, something in the bakery caught his eye. A small framed picture near the counter, one that had been there for decades. He didn't stop, didn't let his expression falter, but as he walked away, the image stuck in his mind. A black and white photo. A woman, standing behind that same counter, smiling warmly at the camera. And next to her, barely reaching her waist, was a small boy. Graham didn't remember taking that photo. But somehow, he knew that little boy was him. Graham didn't sleep well that night. He had left the bakery without another word, walking briskly back to his car, ignoring the curious stares from Theo and Maggie, shutting the door harder than necessary as his driver pulled away from the curb. He told himself it was nothing, that the familiarity he'd felt was just a coincidence, a trick of the mind, a passing déjà vu that meant nothing. But it wasn't. Because the moment he had seen that photo near the counter, something had cracked open inside him. He hadn't thought about his childhood in years. He had no reason to. The past was something he had left behind, buried beneath the weight of success, of ambition, of the relentless drive to never be small or powerless again. He had erased it so completely that even the details, the little moments, the quiet memories, had faded into something distant and unreachable. But now, they were clawing their way back. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling of his penthouse, the city lights casting long shadows across the walls. His mother's face came to him in pieces, as if his mind had to reconstruct her from fragments. He could barely remember the sound of her voice, but he remembered the way she smelled, like lavender and flower, always tired but always soft when she held him close. He remembered the way she would tuck her hair behind her ear when she was thinking, the tiny crease between her brows when she counted coins in the palm of her hand. And he remembered the bakery. It had been their small escape. She hadn't been able to afford much. Most days, dinner was whatever was cheap, whatever stretched far enough to last the week. But sometimes, when things weren't so bad, when she had an extra $1 or $2 and the weight of the world wasn't pressing quite so heavily on her shoulders, she would take him by the hand and walk him down to the bakery. Maggie's bakery. He hadn't known the name then, just the warmth of it, the way the smell of fresh bread wrapped around him like a blanket. His mother would smile in a way she didn't smile anywhere else, leaning over the counter to pick out the softest, freshest sugar-dusted buns. "Best way to start the day," she'd say, ruffling his hair as they sat by the window, splitting one between them. He had loved those mornings. And then, one day, they had stopped coming. His mother had lost her job, money had gotten tighter, and the little luxuries, the sugar buns, the warmth, the moments of pause, had disappeared. Eventually, everything else had disappeared too. Graham closed his eyes, exhaling sharply. He refused to think about what had happened next. But now, decades later, he had walked into that same bakery, seen those same counters, smelled that same bread, and it had all come rushing back with a force he wasn't prepared for. He didn't know what to do with it, didn't know why it unsettled him so much. And what bothered him most of all was that he hadn't recognized it sooner. How had he forgotten? The next day, he told himself he wouldn't go back. He would focus on his work, drown himself in numbers and deals and meetings, and push the past back where it belonged. But late in the afternoon, he found himself standing outside the bakery again. He didn't step inside, didn't even linger. He just stood there, watching through the window as Theo buzzed around, wiping down tables with more enthusiasm than actual effectiveness. Maggie was behind the counter, rolling dough, chatting with a customer like she had known them her whole life. And for the first time in a long time, Graham felt like an intruder in a place that had once been his. He turned to leave, but before he could take a step, the door swung open. "Hey!" Theo's voice rang out, high and bright, and before Graham could react, the kid had already bounded up to him, wiping flour-dusted hands on his apron. "You came back." Graham forced a smirk. "Don't flatter yourself, kid. I was just passing by." Theo squinted at him suspiciously, as if trying to decide whether he believed him. "You want to come in? We're trying out a new recipe. You could be a taste tester." Graham snorted. "I told you, I don't eat sweets." Theo made a face. "Still the saddest thing I've ever heard." Graham exhaled, shaking his head, but before he could make another excuse to leave, Theo suddenly tilted his head, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "Hey, wait," the boy said. "Did your mom ever take you for sugar buns?" The question hit him like a freight train. Graham froze. He didn't know why it affected him so much, why the simple innocence of it felt like something sharp lodging itself in his ribs. Theo wasn't prying, wasn't accusing, wasn't even looking for anything deeper. It was just a question. A child's curiosity. But Graham couldn't answer. For the first time in decades, words failed him. He turned on his heel without another word, walking away before Theo could ask anything else, before he could see whatever it was flickering across Graham's face. Theo stood there for a moment, watching him go, brows knitting together. He didn't understand what had just happened, but he knew he had touched something. Inside the bakery, Maggie had seen everything. She knew that look. It wasn't just a businessman's cold indifference. It was something deeper, something rawer. Something that had been buried for a long time. And as Graham disappeared down the street, shoulders stiff, fists clenched, she realized she had underestimated him. There was a reason he had made that ridiculous bet. He might not have known it at the time, but he had unfinished business with this place. The bakery had been alive with possibility. Theo's plans, however chaotic, had somehow worked, and for the first time in years, Maggie's bakery had lines out the door. The regulars still came for their usual orders, but new customers trickled in too, curious strangers drawn by the chatter of an old shop making a comeback. There was laughter, warmth, the hum of conversation over fresh pastries, and for once, hope didn't seem like a foolish thing to hold on to. Theo thrived in it all, bouncing from table to table, wiping his sugar-coated hands on his apron, proudly taking orders and drawing smiley faces on receipts. Even Maggie, who had once been so convinced this was a lost cause, had started to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could pull this off. And then the fire happened. It started late at night when the bakery was empty, the ovens cold. No arson, no foul play, just a faulty old wire in the back storage room, sparking to life, eating away at the wooden shelves before anyone could notice. By the time the smoke alarms wailed and the fire trucks arrived, the damage had already been done. The flames didn't consume the entire building, but the walls were scorched, the ceilings blackened, the glass display case shattered from the heat. The scent of cinnamon and warm bread had been replaced with the sharp, acrid bite of smoke and burnt wood. Theo didn't understand at first. When his mother shook him awake and rushed him down the street, when he saw the flashing lights and the firefighters still battling the last of the flames, his mind refused to process what he was looking at. It wasn't until he saw Maggie, standing outside with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, staring at the bakery with empty eyes, that the reality sank in. The bakery was gone. The moment the fire chief gave the all-clear, Theo ran forward, shoving past the caution tape, ignoring his mother's voice calling for him to stop. His sneakers crunched over broken glass and fallen debris as he stumbled into what was left of the shop. The counter where Maggie had once handed him fresh pastries was charred, barely recognizable. The tables, the shelves, the old framed photographs, blackened, broken, lost. Even the chalkboard sign with his ridiculous deals had been swallowed by the flames. And then, he saw it. His piggy bank. It sat near the front counter, knocked over, covered in soot, cracked but not completely shattered. Theo fell to his knees, fingers brushing over the ceramic surface, his breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. This was his fault. He had fought so hard to save this place, convinced that if he just tried hard enough, if he just believed, it would all work out. He had thought he could make a difference. But in the end, it didn't matter. The bakery was gone. And there was nothing he could do to fix it. He curled in on himself, holding the piggy bank close, silent tears cutting paths through the dust on his cheeks. Graham arrived minutes later. He hadn't meant to come. He had seen the news, heard about the fire, and his first instinct had been to push it out of his mind. It wasn't his concern. If anything, it just confirmed what he had always known: dreams were fragile, businesses failed, and the past was meant to be erased. This was inevitable. But as he approached the ruined bakery, something unexpected twisted in his chest. He told himself it was just curiosity that led him here. Nothing more. But then he saw Theo. The boy sat in the middle of the wreckage, shoulders shaking, his small hands gripping that soot-covered piggy bank as if it were the last thing in the world keeping him together. And just like that, something cracked inside Graham Westwood. He had seen that look before. Not on Theo. On himself. A long time ago, when he had sat in the back of a cramped apartment, clutching his mother's last paycheck, knowing it would never be enough. Knowing that no matter how hard she worked, how hard she tried, the world didn't care. Something deep and long-buried clawed its way to the surface, and before he could stop himself, he stepped forward. Theo didn't look up as Graham crouched beside him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Graham exhaled. "You didn't lose." Theo's fingers curled tighter around the piggy bank. His voice, when it finally came, was small. Broken. "Then why does it feel like I did?" Graham had no answer for that. He could walk away right now. It would be easy. The fire had done the work for him. The bakery was finished, and there was nothing left for Theo to fight for. No more ridiculous deals, no more stubborn negotiations. No more need for a bet that shouldn't have happened in the first place. But for the first time in his life, Graham didn't want to walk away. He had spent years convincing himself that sentimentality was weakness, that the past was nothing more than dead weight, that success meant never looking back. But as he looked at Theo, at the way the boy sat in the middle of the wreckage, clutching onto something that no longer existed, he realized something. Maybe he had been wrong. Maybe, just this once, the past was worth saving. Graham Westwood, the man who never made decisions based on emotion, made one then. He wasn't going to let this be the end. Graham wasn't sure what he was doing. Standing in the middle of the charred remains of the bakery, watching Theo clutch that soot-covered piggy bank like it was the last thing holding his world together, something inside him shifted. He had spent his entire life walking away from the past, burning bridges before anyone else could burn them for him. And yet, here he was, making a decision that went against everything he had built himself to believe. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "All right, kid," he said, breaking the heavy silence. "Let's fix this." Theo sniffed, rubbing a sleeve across his face before looking up at him. His eyes, red-rimmed and puffy, blinked in confusion. "What?" Graham rose to his feet, brushing dust off his pants, and gestured at the wreckage. "We rebuild." Theo stared at him, as if trying to figure out whether this was a trick. But I lost. The deal was... "I don't care about the deal." Graham cut in, his voice firmer than he intended. "The bet was stupid. This isn't about that anymore." Maggie, who had been standing near the bakery's entrance, arms crossed tightly over her chest, finally spoke up. "So what is it about, Westwood?" Graham hesitated. The truth sat heavy in his chest, unspoken. It was about a bakery that had once been a safe haven for a boy who never had much. It was about a mother who had worked herself to the bone just to afford a small moment of happiness. It was about the ghosts of a past he had spent too long pretending didn't exist. But Graham Westwood wasn't the kind of man who talked about things like that. So instead, he straightened his shoulders and said, "It's about business." Maggie snorted, shaking her head. "Of course it is." But before she could say anything else, Graham turned to Theo. "Here's the new deal," he said. "I'll fund the rebuild. No strings attached. But when the bakery reopens, you and Maggie run it together. And I don't mean as some childhood fantasy, I mean a real partnership. We make this place stronger than it was before." Theo blinked, processing his words. "Wait. You mean? Like you're helping us?" Graham smirked. "I'm investing in you." Theo stared at him for a long moment, then turned to Maggie. "Do we shake on it?" Maggie, who had clearly been on the verge of refusing, hesitated. She looked at Theo, at the way he was still gripping that piggy bank like it held the last scraps of his heart, and sighed. "I must be out of my mind," she muttered before stepping forward and offering Graham her hand. Graham took it. The moment their hands met, Theo let out a whoop, throwing his arms in the air. "Yes! We're back in business!" Sarah, who had been standing behind them with wide eyes, finally let out a breath. "I can't believe I'm saying this, but I think I'm actually relieved Westwood just bought a bakery instead of destroying it." Eleanor, who had arrived at the scene minutes earlier, watching the exchange unfold, smirked. "That makes two of us." Word spread fast. By morning, the entire neighborhood knew. People came by, offering condolences, sharing their memories of the bakery, reminiscing about the first pastries they had ever bought there. And then, something else happened, something none of them expected. The community didn't just mourn the loss. They rallied. People offered their skills: painters, carpenters, electricians. Customers pooled money to help cover what insurance wouldn't. Even businesses that had once been competitors started donating supplies. It was as if the bakery had been the heart of something much bigger, and now, everyone was determined to help rebuild it stronger than before. Theo had never looked prouder in his life. He spent every waking moment at the construction site, overseeing things with the exaggerated seriousness of a CEO, walking around with a clipboard he had found in a supply closet. "You sure you don't want to hire an actual project manager for this?" Eleanor asked Graham one afternoon, watching Theo argue with a contractor about the best spot for a new cookie display. Graham smirked. "Why? He seems to be handling it just fine." Eleanor shook her head. "You've gone soft. Don't start." But Eleanor just grinned, watching as Theo beamed up at a carpenter who had agreed to build him a custom, secret ingredient, shelf behind the counter. The rebuild took weeks, but somehow, it felt like no time at all. The bakery that had once been cozy and warm was now something even better, still familiar, still filled with the same love and history, but modernized, reinforced, made to last. And then, finally, the grand reopening arrived. The air outside the bakery buzzed with excitement as the crowd gathered. Balloons were tied to the railings, and a fresh chalkboard sign stood proudly by the door, its new slogan scrawled in bright letters, "Baking memories since forever." Maggie, standing in her new uniform, flour-dusted apron and all, sniffed, blinking away the emotion she refused to acknowledge. "Well," she said, glancing at Graham, "I suppose you're not as much of a lost cause as I thought." Graham smirked. "Careful, Dawson. People might start thinking you like me." Maggie rolled her eyes but didn't argue. Then, as the countdown began and Theo prepared to cut the ribbon, he turned to Graham, grinning ear to ear. "You know," Theo said, peering up at him, "you should smile more." Graham raised a brow. "Oh?" Theo nodded. "Yeah. You look less like a villain when you do." Eleanor choked on a laugh. Maggie smirked. The crowd chuckled. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Graham Westwood actually smiled. The ribbon was cut, the doors opened, and the bakery, reborn, stronger than ever, welcomed the world once again. Months passed, and Maggie's bakery was not just back, it was thriving. The new building still carried the heart of the old one, but now it was sturdier, brighter, built to last. The walls were freshly painted, the floors refinished, and the once cramped kitchen had been expanded with state-of-the-art ovens that Maggie swore she would never fully trust. Despite the upgrades, the bakery still smelled the same: warm dough, cinnamon, a touch of vanilla, the scent of home. The customers came in droves, not just for the pastries but for the story. Everyone in the neighborhood knew what had happened, how the bakery had nearly been lost, how a 7-year-old boy and an unlikely billionaire had saved it together. It was no longer just Maggie's bakery, it was their bakery, a place that belonged to the community. Theo, of course, had declared himself assistant manager, a title he had given himself without consulting anyone. After school, he would rush in, tying his too-big apron around his waist, standing behind the counter with the same confidence as a seasoned professional. His piggy bank, once a desperate symbol of an impossible dream, now sat proudly by the register, repurposed as a tip jar. Graham stopped by more often than he intended. At first, he told himself he was just checking on his investment, making sure his money wasn't going to waste. But that excuse wore thin when he started swinging by just to watch the place operate, sipping black coffee at a corner table as he listened to the familiar murmur of customers chatting, the bell above the door jingling with each new arrival. It was strange, this sense of belonging. He wasn't sure what to do with it. One afternoon, Eleanor smirked at him over her coffee. "You realize you own skyscrapers and entire city blocks, but you come here more than any of your own buildings." Graham didn't look up from his newspaper. "It's a sound investment." "Right," Eleanor said dryly, blowing on her drink. "And the way you actually look happy when you're here has nothing to do with it." He ignored her, but she wasn't wrong. One day, Theo marched up to him, hands on his hips. "If you're gonna keep coming here, you have to help." Graham raised a brow. "I am helping. I funded this place." Theo shook his head. "Nope. That doesn't count. You have to actually do something." Before Graham could protest, Maggie appeared behind him and plopped a chef's hat onto his head. "Aprons in the back, Westwood." Graham scowled. "This is not happening." It happened. What followed was an unmitigated disaster. Graham Westwood, the man who had built a billion-dollar empire, who had negotiated high-stakes deals with ruthless efficiency, had no idea how to bake. He burned a tray of muffins within minutes, spilled flour all over himself, and somehow managed to break an egg in the most illogical way possible. Maggie shook her head in exasperation. Theo cackled so hard he nearly fell off his stool. Graham dusted himself off, glaring at the ruined muffins. "I don't understand. I followed the instructions." Maggie sighed, wiping her hands on her apron. "Baking isn't just following instructions, Westwood. You gotta feel it." Graham muttered something about the ridiculousness of feeling dough, but he didn't argue. Later, as he sat at his usual table, scowling at his own failure, Theo plopped down across from him, grinning. "You know," the boy said, resting his chin on his hands, "you're really bad at this." Graham sipped his coffee. "I noticed." Theo giggled, kicking his legs under the table. "But you don't give up easy." "That's good." Graham glanced at him, something warm settling in his chest. He didn't say it out loud, but he knew. It wasn't just about the bakery anymore. Late one evening, long after the bakery had closed for the night, Graham sat in his office, the city sprawled out in glittering lights below him. His desk was covered in reports, contracts, emails demanding his attention. But he wasn't looking at any of them. Instead, his eyes rested on the small paper bag sitting in front of him. He reached for it slowly, unrolling the top. Inside, nestled carefully, was a sugar-dusted bun. Maggie had sent it with him before he left the bakery that evening, shoving it into his hands without a word. For a long moment, he simply stared at it. Then, almost hesitantly, he picked it up and took a bite. The taste hit him like a memory he had long forgotten. Soft, warm, perfectly sweet, the same as it had been all those years ago. He closed his eyes. For the first time in his life, he let himself remember. He saw his mother's tired smile, the way she had once ruffled his hair. He heard her voice, gentle but firm, telling him that no matter how hard things got, there were always small joys to hold on to. He felt the warmth of those mornings, sitting by the bakery window, splitting a sugar bun with her, thinking that maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't so bad. When he opened his eyes, the office around him felt colder than before. He swallowed, staring down at the half-eaten pastry in his hand. For years he had built his life on the idea that nothing lasted. That things, people, memories, they all faded, crumbled, disappeared. But as he sat there, the taste of sugar still on his tongue, he realized something. Some things were worth saving. Some things were worth keeping. And maybe, just maybe, he had finally found one. The next morning, as the sun cast a golden glow over the city, Graham Westwood found himself walking toward the bakery without even thinking about it. It had become a habit, one he hadn't quite acknowledged yet. There was something about this place, about the warmth that spilled from its doors, about the way laughter and the scent of fresh bread mixed in the air, that kept pulling him back. It wasn't just an investment anymore. It wasn't just about making sure his money was well spent. It was something else, something he wasn't ready to put into words. When he stepped inside, the familiar bell jingled above the door, and the noise of the morning rush wrapped around him. Maggie was behind the counter, expertly handling multiple orders at once. Flour dusted across her apron as she handed out pastries with the same practiced ease she always had. The tables were full, customers sipping coffee, chatting, breaking apart warm bread and pastries, just like they had for decades. And in the middle of it all was Theo, standing on his stool behind the register, his curls slightly disheveled, his grin wide as he greeted every customer like an old friend. The sight of it settled something deep in Graham's chest. "Morning, Mr. Westwood!" Theo called out as soon as he spotted him, his face lighting up. Graham smirked. "You ever take a day off, kid?" Theo shrugged dramatically. "Nope. I'm very important around here." Maggie snorted, handing a tray of croissants to a waiting customer. "You mean you're very bossy?" Theo ignored her, turning back to Graham. "You want your usual coffee?" Graham raised an eyebrow. "I have a usual now?" "Yep," Theo said, nodding seriously as he punched buttons on the register. "Black coffee, no sugar, 'cause you're boring. But today..." His grin turned mischievous. "Today you get a special deal." Graham sighed. "Dare I ask?" Theo grabbed a bag from behind the counter and shoved it into Graham's hands. "One free sugar bun. No negotiation." Graham stared down at the bag. Theo smiled up at him. "Maggie says sometimes you don't have to deserve good things. Sometimes you just get them." Something tightened in Graham's throat. For so long, he had believed in one thing above all else: nothing came for free. If you wanted something, you fought for it. If you lost, you moved on. There was no room for sentiment, no room for things that couldn't be measured in numbers and profits. But standing here, in this bakery that had once been nothing more than a mark on a blueprint, surrounded by people who had fought to save something simply because it mattered, he wondered if maybe he had been wrong. He glanced at Maggie, who was watching him with that knowing look she always had, like she saw straight through him. Then at Theo, beaming up at him, completely unaware of how much he had changed the course of Graham's life without even trying. Graham exhaled, shaking his head as he tucked the bag under his arm. "You really don't take no for an answer, do you?" "Nope," Theo said proudly. Graham chuckled. "Dangerous skill to have." Theo shrugged. "Worked on you." Maggie laughed, and for once, Graham didn't roll his eyes. Instead, he sat down at his usual table, the one by the window, the one where his mother had once sat with him all those years ago. He unrolled the top of the bag, pulled out the sugar-dusted bun, and took a slow bite. And just like the night before, the taste carried him back to a time when he had been small, when life had been simpler, when his mother's hand had been warm in his own. He could almost hear her voice, almost feel the weight of her kindness. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Graham Westwood let himself sit in that moment. Let himself feel. And as he watched Theo race around the bakery, greeting customers, stuffing extra napkins into people's hands, drawing another smiley face on a receipt, Graham realized something. Some things were worth keeping. Some things were worth coming back to. And maybe, just maybe, some things were even worth belonging to. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave a like, it really helps out the channel. And if you want more heartwarming and emotional stories like this, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this one. I'd love to hear your reactions. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.